Everyone turned when the elevator doors opened. The polished marble floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, casting reflections of perfectly shined shoes and tailored suits. But the man who stepped out didn't fit the picture. He was soaked in mud, from his boots to his shirt, his entire presence jarring against the pristine elegance of the lobby. His gray t-shirt clung to his chest, drenched. His pants were heavy, soaked through and streaked with dark stains. Mud trailed behind him with every step. His beard was untrimmed, his hair wet and matted to his forehead, and his shoes squelched with each movement. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes turned, then narrowed. The contrast was too much to ignore. A room full of candidates in crisp suits and polished confidence, and then him, a man who looked like he had just clawed his way out of a landslide. Low chuckles echoed. A few people exchanged glances, smirks curling at the corners of their mouths. "Did he get lost?" someone whispered. A security guard stepped forward, uncertain. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?" The man didn't flinch. He didn't rush to explain himself. Instead, with calm and quiet resolve, he pulled a damp piece of paper from his pocket, an official interview confirmation, folded and creased. He handed it to the guard without saying a word. The guard hesitated, eyebrows raised, and then, striding out from behind the reception desk, came Gregory Vaughn, head of human resources. Perfect posture, perfect suit, and a perfectly condescending tone. His eyes scanned the muddy footprints, then landed on the man. "We're conducting executive interviews today, not hosting disaster victims." A few people snickered. Gregory stepped closer. "I'm going to need you to leave, sir. This is a professional environment. You're clearly not a fit." The man opened his mouth, but Gregory cut him off with a raised hand. "You can explain outside. Security will escort you." The crumpled paper was tossed in a nearby bin. Laughter rippled through the lobby, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. And the man turned, slowly, his soaked shoes leaving a trail of muddy shame behind him as he walked back toward the elevator. No one asked why he looked that way. No one wondered what had happened to bring him there like that. No one cared. But that would change, because the next morning, a sleek Bugatti would park right outside those doors, and inside it, the truth about who he really was, and why judging by appearances might be the most dangerous mistake of all. His name was Jonathan Wells, and despite the mud on his clothes and the laughter echoing in that lobby, he was anything but insignificant. Jonathan had always believed that real change began with small, consistent acts of compassion. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, he wasn't even particularly well educated. But what he lacked in titles, he more than made up for in grit, empathy, and an unwavering sense of duty to others. By day, Jonathan worked as a janitor at Roosevelt Elementary School. His hands bore the marks of years spent fixing leaking pipes, scrubbing floors, and patching cracked windows. Yet after the school bell rang and the last child went home, he transformed into something else, a community hero, the quiet kind the world rarely applauds. He was the founder of Rebuild Futures, a grassroots organization born from necessity. 5 years earlier, after witnessing a neighbor's home destroyed by floods and government help never arriving, Jonathan decided to act. What began as one man with a toolbox and borrowed materials became a growing network of volunteers. They didn't just patch roofs or repaint walls, they rebuilt lives. One of the first homes he ever restored belonged to the Thompsons, a single mother and her 3 children. After a sudden landslide left their house barely standing, Jonathan worked through nights and weekends to rebuild it from the ground up. He brought in volunteers, secured donated supplies, and even paid for materials out of his own pocket. When they moved back in, the kids had bedrooms again, and their mother cried in his arms. Stories like that weren't rare for him. They were his routine, and on the morning of that ill-fated interview, he had planned everything to go smoothly. He woke up early, put on the cleanest clothes he owned, a faded gray t-shirt and a pair of dark slacks, and printed out his resume at the public library. This interview wasn't just a job opportunity, it was a potential breakthrough. The position would offer not just a better life for him and his wife, but also access to resources and networks that could scale Rebuild Futures far beyond anything he'd imagined. But life had other plans. At 8:12 a.m., as he waited for his train, Jonathan received a call from Marisol, one of the key volunteers. Her voice shook. "John, it's bad. The hillside behind the Gonzalez house gave out. It's flooding, and the grandmother's still inside." Without hesitation, he abandoned the platform and ran back to his van. When he arrived, the street was chaos. Water was rushing through the backyard, mud piling against the walls. Neighbors yelled for help. Children cried. Without stopping to think, Jonathan dove into action. He organized sandbag barriers, helped carry out 2 kids to safety, and finally entered the collapsing back door to lift the elderly woman into his arms and bring her outside. His clothes were soaked, his arms were scratched, his boots were swallowed in sludge, but he didn't care. He stayed until the last person was safe. By the time it was over, he looked down at his watch, 9:02 a.m. The interview was in less than 30 minutes. Across the city, there was no time to change, no time to explain, so he drove, soaked, mud-covered, exhausted, but determined. Because in his heart, he believed that a company with a mission, one that claimed to value innovation, leadership, and human impact, would at least be curious enough to ask why a man would show up like that. He believed they'd see beyond the mud. He was wrong. Jonathan's heart had always been too big for silence. Even as a child growing up in a forgotten town, where people were taught to keep their heads down and accept what life gave them, he resisted. He watched neighbors lose their homes to storms, only to be handed empty promises by politicians and cold rejections by banks. But where others turned bitter, Jonathan turned kind. His philosophy was simple. If I can help, I should. It was that same spirit that led him to meet Laura, the woman who would later become his wife. Though their love story was anything but ordinary, Laura wasn't just beautiful or kind. She was brilliant, quiet, and deeply curious. When she met Jonathan, she wasn't wearing designer clothes or showing off her last name. In fact, she introduced herself as a literature teacher, which was true, but omitted one detail. She was the only daughter of Warren Castell, a reclusive billionaire known for owning a network of tech and finance companies, including the very corporation Jonathan was applying to. She didn't want a life of mansions and obligations. She wanted something real, and Jonathan was as real as it got. Their connection was instant but deep. What moved Laura wasn't just Jonathan's warmth, it was his mission. She saw the way he spoke to children during rebuilds, how he'd carry bricks on his back if it meant one more wall going up. She volunteered with him in secret, working side by side without ever revealing her background. For months, she didn't even tell him her full name. When he found out the truth, he didn't feel betrayed. He smiled, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "So you're rich, but you still make a mean sandwich." They laughed, and that moment said everything about who they were. Laura offered to help fund Rebuild Futures many times, but Jonathan always refused anything that came with conditions or attention. He wanted the project to be community-led, grassroots, something people built together, not something stamped with a billionaire's name. Still, Laura found subtle ways to support it. She used her connections to gather anonymous donations, delivered tools to construction sites under different names, and once even had a medical team show up unannounced to help an injured volunteer, all without ever taking credit. And when she found out about the job opening at her father's company, a new division focused on corporate social responsibility, she saw it as fate. Jonathan would never ask for favors, but she submitted his name quietly, confident he could earn it on his own merit. She never imagined he'd be treated the way he was. That morning, she had no idea he was even going to the interview in such a state. He hadn't wanted to worry her. He didn't want to make excuses. All he told her the night before was, "If it's meant to be, it'll be. And if it's not, that's okay too." But it wasn't okay. Not after what they did to him. Not after the way they looked at him, judged him, laughed at him, all because of mud on his clothes, never bothering to ask how it got there, or why he didn't change. And so Laura made a decision. The next day she would go there herself, but she wouldn't arrive quietly. She would drive the Bugatti, the one her father gave her on her 30th birthday, the one she never used because it didn't feel like her. But now, it had a purpose. She was going to show them exactly who that man they mocked truly was. Jonathan sat alone in his van, the engine off, the world outside moving too fast for his heavy heart. The mud on his clothes had begun to dry in patches, the sting of the lobby's laughter still echoing in his ears. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel strong. He didn't feel sure. He felt small. His hands, the same hands that had built walls, rescued families, wiped away the tears of children, now trembled slightly as they rested on the steering wheel. He stared blankly through the cracked windshield, watching businessmen and women in pressed suits walk by, untouched by the storm that raged inside him. Maybe they were right, he thought bitterly. Maybe I don't belong in places like that. He hated that the thought even crossed his mind. But it did, and once it did, it clung to him, whispering doubts he never knew he carried. Was it foolish to believe that character mattered more than appearances? That kindness could outweigh a resume polished with prestigious names? That mud-caked boots could ever be respected in marble hallways? He remembered Gregory's sneer, the snickers from the waiting candidates, the way security had hovered, not to protect him, but to remove him. He had faced disasters, floods, fires, but nothing felt as devastating as standing there, judged and discarded like trash, without anyone even asking who he was or why he came. For a fleeting, dangerous moment, Jonathan thought about giving up. Let someone else fight the impossible battles. Let someone else rebuild broken homes while the world applauded those who only looked the part. Maybe he was wasting his life trying to fix things no one really cared about. Maybe being good just wasn't enough. The thought made his chest tighten, painfully, because he knew that if he let that bitterness take root, even for a second, he would lose the best parts of himself. Jonathan closed his eyes, gripping the wheel harder. He thought of the Gonzalez family, of the children's faces, when he carried them to safety that morning, of the way Mrs. Gonzalez squeezed his hand and whispered, "Bless you," through her tears. He thought of Laura, of the nights they spent dreaming about a better world, not for themselves, but for the ones who would come after. And slowly, painfully, he realized something. He could not control how others judged him, but he could control who he chose to be. Even if the world only saw a dirty shirt and muddy boots, he knew what those clothes really meant. They were badges of honor, not shame. He started the engine, not to drive away from who he was, but to drive deeper into it. He wasn't finished yet, not even close. Across town, Laura Wells sat at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing relentlessly, with updates from colleagues she hadn't heard from in years. Word had spread, whispers about a man covered in mud who had dared to show up at a prestigious interview and been publicly humiliated. She didn't need to guess who it was. Her heart broke imagining Jonathan standing there alone, judged by people who couldn't begin to comprehend the weight he carried on his shoulders, or the reasons behind his muddy clothes. It wasn't just anger that rose inside her. It was something deeper, a fire born of love, loyalty, and the unshakable certainty that true worth had nothing to do with appearances. Laura knew Jonathan. She knew every scar, every calloused hand, every late-night worry he never spoke aloud. And she knew what the world had just lost by turning its back on a man like him. But she wasn't about to let them forget it. She reached into the closet where they kept gifts they never used, relics of a life she had walked away from. And there, under a dust cloth, gleamed the royal blue Bugatti her father had insisted she take. She had barely touched it, feeling it belonged to a life she had no interest in living. But today, that car had a purpose. Laura threw on a simple black dress, slipped on modest flats, and grabbed the keys. As she slid into the driver's seat, the engine roared to life with a purr so powerful it shook the garage. No grand announcement, no press, no entourage, just a woman on a mission. She knew she couldn't undo the humiliation Jonathan had suffered, but she could make sure the people who laughed at him remembered exactly who they had mocked, and why it mattered. She planned every step carefully. She would arrive unannounced, park where no one could ignore her, and walk straight into the building. She wouldn't shout or cause a scene. She wouldn't need to. The truth would be loud enough, and when she was done, they would understand one thing very clearly. Jonathan Wells wasn't the man who didn't belong. He was the man they should have prayed to meet. The next morning, the lobby buzzed with its usual arrogance. Candidates in sharp suits and polished shoes lined up once again, resumes clutched in manicured hands, ready to compete for the same prestigious position. No one was thinking about the man from the day before. He was already a forgotten joke, a brief whisper of amusement in a world too busy chasing power to remember compassion, until a sound broke the air. A low, thunderous purr echoed off the marble walls, growing louder by the second. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Even Gregory Vaughn, standing proudly near the reception desk, glanced outside with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. The Bugatti came into view, a royal blue blur of power and elegance, sleek and unapologetic. As it pulled right up to the entrance, blocking the automatic doors, the driver's door swung open and out stepped a woman. Simple, elegant, deliberate, Laura Wells. She didn't wear diamonds or designer labels. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough to shift the air around her, commanding attention without a single word. With quiet confidence, she walked into the lobby, each step leaving a trail of silence in her wake. Eyes widened. Whispers started. Who is she? Is that a Bugatti? Before anyone could piece it together, Laura approached the front desk. Calmly, she placed a sleek black folder on the counter. "I need to speak with the executive board," she said, her voice even but sharp enough to slice through the tension. The receptionist, clearly flustered, stammered, Do you have an appointment?" Laura smiled faintly, a smile that said, "I don't need one," and opened the folder just enough for the receptionist to glimpse the document inside. A personal letter from Warren Castell himself, founder and majority owner of the corporation. The color drained from the receptionist's face. She picked up the phone with shaking hands. Within minutes, two senior executives rushed down the escalator, adjusting their ties nervously. Gregory watched, confusion creeping across his face. Then Laura turned to the lobby, the candidates, the staff, the security guards, and with a quiet, devastating precision, she spoke. "I'm here on behalf of someone you all met yesterday," she said. "Someone you dismissed because of the mud on his clothes and the dirt on his boots. Someone you laughed at without ever asking why he looked the way he did." She paused, letting the silence settle like a heavy fog. "His name is Jonathan Wells, and he's the kind of man this world desperately needs." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Without waiting for permission, Laura opened the black folder fully and handed it to the executives. Inside were photos, dozens of them, showing Jonathan leading rebuild projects in flood zones, rescuing families, comforting children. Testimonials from people whose lives he had rebuilt with nothing but a hammer, hope, and his own two hands. The executives flipped through the pages, their faces paling with every turn. "He wasn't late because he was irresponsible," Laura continued. "He was late because he was saving lives, while you were judging shoes." The words hit harder than any shout ever could. Gregory's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And for the first time in that cold, polished building, someone finally saw Jonathan Wells for who he truly was. The lobby stood frozen, every breath held captive in the heavy silence Laura's words left behind. Executives exchanged glances, uncomfortable. Candidates fidgeted with their briefcases and ties, suddenly unsure of their place. Gregory Vaughn, once so smug and composed, looked like a man sinking into the marble floor, wishing he could disappear. Laura wasn't done. She gestured toward the large screen mounted behind the reception desk, usually playing sleek promotional videos about innovation and corporate excellence. But today, she had prepared something different. Within seconds, a video began to play. Footage showed Jonathan wading waist-deep through floodwaters, carrying a child on his shoulders, hammering nails into beams while volunteers worked under the baking sun, hugging a tearful mother as he handed her the keys to a rebuilt home. His face always the same, not seeking recognition, just quietly, stubbornly giving everything he had. The room watched in stunned silence. When the video ended, Laura spoke one last time. "Leadership is not about appearances. It's about sacrifice. It's about serving others when no one is watching. Yesterday, you turned away the best man you'll never deserve." She picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and with the same quiet dignity she entered with, Laura turned and walked toward the door. Before she could reach it, a senior executive hurried after her. "Wait," he called out breathless. "Please, we want to extend an official offer to Mr. Wells. He belongs here." Laura paused. She turned, her expression calm but unyielding. "You had your chance," she said simply, "and he has better things to build." Outside, she stepped back into the Bugatti, the engine roaring back to life. Meanwhile, inside, Gregory Vaughn was called into a closed meeting with the executive board, a meeting that wouldn't end well for him. Public apologies would be issued, statements crafted, Damage controlled, but none of it would erase the truth. Jonathan never needed their validation. He had already built something far more important, a legacy of kindness, courage, and community. And now, thanks to Laura's intervention, the world would finally see it. Donations flooded in to rebuild futures after the story went viral. Volunteers signed up by the hundreds. News crews lined up outside the homes he had rebuilt, eager to tell the real story of the man who chose compassion over status, mud over marble. Jonathan Wells didn't get the corporate title. He got something much greater, and he never had to change who he was to get it. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, the shiniest appearance, and the most polished facade, Jonathan Wells was a quiet rebellion. He never needed tailored suits or luxury, watches to prove his worth. His life was his proof, a testament built not on image, but on action. Every nail he hammered, every wall he rebuilt, every tear he wiped away, was more valuable than any title or corporate handshake. Jonathan taught a lesson that too many forget. True greatness isn't found in corner offices or behind gold-plated nameplates. It's found in muddy boots, calloused hands, and a heart willing to serve without applause. When others laughed, he lifted. When others judged, he built. When others turned away, he stayed. The people who mocked him that day learned something, perhaps the hard way. That humility is not weakness. That compassion is not foolishness. That the worth of a person is measured not by the suit they wear, but by the lives they touch. Jonathan Wells didn't just rebuild homes. He rebuilt hope, and maybe, just maybe, the next time they see someone walking in, drenched and out of place, they'll stop to ask a different question. Not, "Why are you here?" but "How can I help?" Because sometimes the person who seems most out of place is the one who belongs there the most. If you thought this story was powerful, wait until you see the simple man who changed an entire town with just one act of kindness.